In 1996, Robert Bork, Reagan's rejected Supreme Court nominee, penned a book, Slouching Towards Gomorrah, which was an indictment of the moral decline in America and its causes. That book came out in 1996, and after more than 20 years, his assessment and his warning is proven to be prophetic. His expressed concern for the court's growing hostility towards religion has been realized and celebrated within the secular world. His warning about the growing acceptance of sexual immorality now finds fulfillment in policy decisions and court cases that have sought to legitimize homosexuality and transgenderism. Bork recognized the importance of morality in sustaining a society. And so, as we witness the devastating effects of the onslaught of immorality within our nation, we must choose whether to turn a blind eye to the problem or see it for what it is. Regardless, our society is not the first to face such a challenge. Indeed, every society faces this challenge at one time or another, and often regularly in a cycle of events. But the direction chosen when we meet that crossroads makes a difference every single time. While Israel's second generation had risen to the challenge to take the land of Canaan under the leadership of Joshua, the years that followed immediately after that moved them steadily and surely away from God. The first 16 chapters of the book of Judges, if you'll go ahead and turn there, it chronicles the ups and downs of their decline, mostly downs, with a few little, we're going to come back up because we're having a problem moments under a judge. And then see, here's overall where they're going as they're just slowly in decline. But when you get to chapters 17 through 21, we sometimes do not realize that that is not chronologically oriented. That is topical. That you have the end of Samson's life in verse 16, or chapter 16. But in chapter 17 through 21, it actually goes back earlier in time to the time of the judges, sometime probably around Deborah, maybe a little bit later to Gideon, that time period. And it's designed to help us see the reasons why everything happened as it did, by giving us examples of where the people were spiritually. One such account we will look at this evening is found in Judges chapter 19. We're going to look at verses 1 through 28. That's not the entirety of this account in reality, but it's what we're going to focus on here this evening. And in it, it shows just how much of the world remained in Israel and why they had so many problems. So if you will follow along as we read these verses. And it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, she was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days, so they ate and drank and lodged there. Then it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and he stood to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way. So they sat down, and the 2 of them ate and drank together. Then the young woman's father said to the man, please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry. And when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, so he lodged there again. Then he arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. But the young woman's father said, please refresh your heart. So they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. And when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, Look, the day is now drawing toward evening. Please spend the night. See, the day is coming to an end. Lodge here, that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early, so that you may get home." However, the man was not willing to spend that night, so he rose and departed and came to opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. With him were the 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine was also with him. They were near Jebus, and the day was far spent. And the servant said to his master, "Come, please, and let us turn aside into this city of the Jebusites and lodge in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not of the children of Israel. We will go on to Gibeah." So he said to his servant, "Come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah." And they passed by and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go to the lodge in Gibeah, and when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Just then an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who also was from the mountains of Ephraim. He was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" So he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah. Now I am going to the house of the Lord. There is no one who will take me into his house. Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for the young man who is with your servant, there is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square." So he brought him into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. As they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally." But the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please, but to this man do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not heed him. So the man took his concubine and brought her out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was till it was light. When her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, there was his concubine fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up and let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. We often bemoan some of the changes taking place in our country, and rightfully so. But until we understand how all of these things contribute to the breakdown of society as a whole, we're going to continue to be surprised at things that happen instead of motivated to speak up, stand up, and try to do something about it. As we look through this reading, we're going to notice several principles about society as a general rule. And to understand how in Judges in this chapter, he has put them together to note all of these different problems contributing ultimately to what has happened here. We're going to go through them and note how similar they are. They ought to sound very much like something you've heard before. The first is this: society will break down when there is little to no accountability. In verse 1, he starts off by saying, "In that day there was no king in Israel." That was a theme that he began in chapter 17. You see again here, and then he closes the book with that. The core idea is that there was no one else overall to enforce them in what they were going to do. In John 12, verse 48, Jesus says, "He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one to judge him. The word that I have spoken shall judge him in that last day." In Romans chapter 2 and verse 6, we find The same thing is true that God will judge everyone according to his work, and there is no partiality with God. Verse 11. There are standards that are spiritual standards, moral standards that transcend whatever man is doing. But what we find in society, which is essentially about all men regardless, that when you don't have someone in that society and the society as a whole keeping those standards up, that you will continue to drop and drop and drop until this is where you end up. Over the last several years, not only has religious interest dipped and slipped throughout America, but many religious groups have completely abandoned any sense of upholding moral standards. As a whole, that stand for morality in the country is continuing to go down and down, and it shows. In which we find more and more people that are simply making compromises when it comes to the lust of the flesh, thus the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16, where this is what people just expect, and we end up with arguments saying people are going to do it anyway. Where does that stop? If that applies to this verse, people are going to do it anyway. Where do you end up? When people have no spiritual accountability to restrain them to moral standards, they fall back on the mores of society. What does society do to hold us back? When the mores of society then decline, they fall back to the standards of government and what the law says at its very basic, primitive notion. Here is what is our morality. And when the government then fails to hold people accountable for their morality, society soon begins to fall apart completely. This is why more than ever we must uphold divine standards for ourselves, for our children, and for one another. Or we're going to become just like the world that brings such shame. In John 17, verse 17, Jesus says, "Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth." If we do not keep the high standard of God, of truth, always firmly in place, then we not only are going to suffer ourselves, but we cannot be a light to a world that needs that high standard placed before them so desperately. Second thing, society will break down when marriage is not respected. In verses 2 through 4, you can note and see the situation that they were in. And there are really three main problems I want us to note all around this principle. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, it says, "What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." A high view and respect of what marriage should be and what God designed it to be. Society needs men to step up and learn how to love, value, and cherish marriage and their wives instead of objectifying them. That's number one. You notice the very nature of it. We won't get into the whole nature of a concubine, but the very core aspect of that is not marriage as it should be. Ephesians 5, verse 25, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." We find society breaking down, and what do you find? Absent fathers. They don't even know to have a role model because dad's not there. Dad isn't dad. And so it falls on somebody else who can't be there all the time. And it falls on public figures, and it falls on sports figures who themselves are not good role models for the most part. Society doesn't have good fathers as a rule. And you end up with all these problems coming in because of also men falling prey to all the things that they say they don't want in regards to their wives, but they're falling prey to pornography. They're falling prey to treating their wives as something other than someone special in a relationship that is God designed. And you see it all the time in society. We also need women who value marriage and their own purity, both before and after marriage. What does she do? She goes out and plays the harlot. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18, flee fornication. Quite very different when you turn to Ephesians 5, verse 22. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord. To have a respect for that relationship and what you have in it, instead of acting like it's no big deal. The more we have in which marriage is treated as no big deal, it's no wonder then that you've got so much confusion among the children growing up. They don't know what a home is. Because mom and dad aren't really doing a good job showing it to them. There's not love, there are not roles, there is not care, and there certainly is not God. This world desperately needs parents who themselves teach their children the biblical view of marriage instead of selfishly seeking their own interest and interfering. That's something else. Did you notice where the problem comes in next? It's dad. It's the father-in-law. She runs home to dad. Dad encourages her to run home to dad and then tries to keep the man there when he's there. Why? Because someone didn't leave and cleave. And dad didn't let go. Genesis 2, verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife. The two shall become one flesh. All this creates instability in children's lives. If you want to do the research, go ahead and look at some of the scientific studies demonstrating this, and yet we continue in society to encourage behavior that is destructive to society. Thirdly, society will decay and break down when ease and comfort distract people from their purpose. Verses 5 through 9. Here we find everything's great and they're just doing nothing. We're enjoying ourselves, and everyone needs to be able to have time to do that. But notice what the end problem was. Is the man was so weak-willed in deciding what to do of why he originally went down there. He didn't go down there to be entertained. But that ended up being what dominated him. And when he finally decides to leave, it's only after yet more entertaining, which caused him to leave late, which put him in the situation that he found himself in Gibeah. We have so many things to make our lives easy and convenient that we have come to expect everything to be equally easy and convenient, including our morality and our Christianity. It's got to be easy. It's got to be easier. We don't have time for it. It's got to be easy or I can't do that. And so as a result, we have in many ways in society given up on doing hard things, and the hard things are those things that are usually the most worth doing. Parents do not expect their children to do chores because that would take their time, attention, and effort parenting. Despite that's what's best for the kids. Students expect grades to be given, not earned. And guess who's taught them that? Well, some teachers, parents, government. It's really sad to watch in college a child thinking that because they're enrolled that they're entitled to a passing grade, when that's all they've done was enroll. We have teenagers shying away from jobs because they are beneath them. Like what? I'm not pointing them specifically, but in society, what job is beneath you? You're at the bottom. You're just starting. 1 Timothy 4, verse 12, the whole key there is, let no man despise your youth. How? By the way in which you behave. Not everyone ought to look up to me because, hey, I'm young and I've got fresh ideas. There's some of us that are old, we still have fresh ideas too. Plus, we have experience. And we've experienced having fresh ideas. So that's not we get distracted so easily. Computer doesn't load as fast as I want it to load. Something's not working right. That projector, I turn it on and off because I'm expecting it to come on right when I hit the switch. Rather than seeking to be productive citizens, we have many who are content to be consumer citizens. Because their primary purpose is to live at the expense of everyone around them. And that can take a number of forms. You're probably thinking of only one or two. But where let's make it real simple. Is it really that hard to return your shopping cart to the corral, people? Someone's got to do it. But we're too lazy to take it back. And that's just one symptom of how it is far more pervasive a problem of entitlement than what we often like to believe. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, the principle there of a man does not work, neither should he eat. We need to recognize there's an expectation for us in society. People somehow have come to think that their employer owes them a paycheck regardless of whether they come to work. That is a sign, all of these, of a dying society. Number 4, society will decay when selfishness replaces loving your neighbor. Oh, what do we find when we get down here and they are looking for a place and they're traveling? We find people that don't have time for them, that aren't going to open up their homes, are not going to take care of them in any way. Quite to the contrary. They have everything they need except for a place to stay, and no one wants to have anything to do with them. And yet, they all know it's dangerous for them to be out. Romans 13, verse 8 says, "Oh man, no man anything but to love one another." We've got to make sure that we are not selfishly doing things when we ought to be loving people. Racial division in this country remains a problem in society. And it's essential we don't let that bleed over into our thinking. I don't care what race you're talking about, don't let it bleed over. Galatians 3, verse 28. Now, I know he's talking specifically about within the body of Christ, of what you gain. There is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female, for you're all one in Christ. But you know what? To get to that point, you have to think that way before they become Christians. And we have to all think about ourselves that way, and think about and see people as souls in need that we love. The person who is, you don't know, that dresses funny to your way of thinking, they still need your love. They still are going to need your care, and they're still going to need the gospel that you know. There are plenty of con men out there trying to take advantage of this system. I've seen plenty myself. But that does not give us an excuse to not help anybody and to end up cutting off our hearts to where we don't have room to be giving to people and helping them. James chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, that is the example given of where you reach the point of where you don't really think you have to do anything with your Christianity. You just it's just a belief. You're not going to help people. We're going to make rules about that, about who is worthy. Now, we don't need to be giving help to somebody when we know what they're doing with it is sinful. We don't need to do anything that encourages that. We sure need to be willing to help people in their needs, as he states them then. What are they? They're naked. They're poorly clothed. So what do? You get them something that clothes them. They don't have a meal. Get them a meal now. Sometimes that's where you find somebody. They don't really want either one of those things. But if that's a need, if that's a real need, let's meet it. We often act like we don't have time for others. If we don't have time for others, especially those in need, then we're spending too much time thinking about ourselves. Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, "As you therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith." Until we address these issues as a society, we will continue to slide down morally. Fifthly, society will decay when lawlessness is expected and accepted. Verses 20 and 21, what do we find going on? "The old man said, 'Peace be with you, however, let all your needs be my responsibility, only do not spend the night in the open square.'" That's an important term. "So he brought them into his house and gave fodder for the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank." Why did he not want them to spend the night in the open square? He knew what the people were like and what to expect. Society has reached a low point when you can see what's going on and predict bad behavior so obviously. 1 John 3, verse 4, the nature of sin itself is, he says there, lawlessness. It's amazing that we've reached the point in society where large groups of people spend their time defending people who are breaking the law. I'm not talking about a public defender just trying to do that. I'm talking about people just coming to the defense of people who have obviously done something wrong. But there's always a justification for it. And yet it is predictable today just as much as it was in the time of the judges. We have prominent people suggesting that the riots in Ferguson, Baltimore, and elsewhere are somehow protected speech. There were laws being broken. They weren't just talking. Breaking through a window in someone's shop isn't speech. It's against the law. But people want to make excuses. Why? Because that's where we are in society. We have governmental officials define immigration laws as if protecting criminals is a humanitarian effort. What does that tell you? That's where we are in society. The law doesn't matter, and protecting people who don't accept the law is more important. We have lawyers arguing that a teenager who kills 4 people is the victim because he grew up in a wealthy home. I'm still trying to figure out that logic. When any excuse is accepted, lawlessness is to be expected. If we as society are going to give excuses ready-made to people breaking the law, you know what you can expect? A lot more people breaking the law. And that's not good for society. Number 6, society will decay when sexual perversion is treated as normal. Verses 22 through 25, you have a record of something so heinous. First of all, the men coming, and it ought to remind you immediately of Genesis 19, of what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. Coming to the door, demanding a visitor so that they can rape him. But it's okay, they worked out a compromise. They just let them rape the concubine. Well, that satisfies everybody, doesn't it? That's what goes on when we lower our standards of what we are thinking we are as people. In Romans chapter 1, 26 and 27, there Paul described this as being perversion, abhorrent, an abomination. Who would have thought, even just a few years ago, that not only would homosexuality be accepted by society, but completely normalized, those are two different things, and promoted, that's yet another level. In Leviticus 18, verse 22, all the way back in the law, there's a reason why it was condemned. And it was condemned also in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, by simply pointing out this: if you do that, you can't go to heaven. But it doesn't end there. Transgenderism has become the new wave of perversion, which denies, number one, biology, and it encourages mental illness. But that's what's going on here. What are we doing? We are justifying whatever people do, even if it's bad for them. Deuteronomy 22, verse 5 addresses that. Bestiality may still be rare, but it is happening even here. You know, when you got someone that wants to marry his horse, you got a problem in your society. If it's one person. Leviticus 18, verse 23. Pedophilia is now pushing for acceptance. And you're thinking to yourself, that'll never happen. Go back and review points 1, 2, and 3 of what you thought would happen. And they're pushing for this acceptance because that's how perversion works. Sin keeps pushing down further and further and further until the lowest of the low of sin is accepted by a society. And they who do such things shall not enter the kingdom of heaven, Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21. But here's the thing, my friends, let's not forget this. The first step was the acceptance of fornication as a lifestyle in society. We started down the path a long time ago. Flee youthful lusts, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. Until we put the line back where God put it, we're going to continue to spiral downward, not only in this country, but in the church. When you have no standards, you have no basis for lodging any objection. It's why really today, the only kind of thing that you're allowed to do is you can't be a hypocrite. That's the one big sin. It's hypocrisy. Now notice why this works. If you don't have any standards, hypocrisy is never going to be a problem. And therefore it only is applied to those people who have standards. And that's where many in this country are today. Number 7. Society will decay when people do not value life. And I'm not just talking about the people who gang raped this woman, but the callousness showed by the man himself. Can you imagine? You walk out after sending her out there, and you know what it's about. She's lying, not moving, on the threshold. You open the door and tell her to get up. How sad it is that people can see, though, the fallen bodies of children affected by chemical gases and recognize that it justifies a military strike. But they can't see an aborted fetus and recognize that the same logic would apply. Now, I'm not calling on a Tomahawk missile to go to the nearest Planned Parenthood. But exactly how much different are those situations? An attack on innocent people with chemical weapons, that's a heinous action, but no more so than abortion. We make ourselves feel better because we're getting onto them for doing something heinous while we practice something that's pretty much the same. There's hypocrisy in a society. And our familiarity with the problem of abortion should not lessen our recognition that it is cold, calculated infanticide. Euthanasia, which is growing in popularity in some states. The lawful murder of the elderly. I'm not sure that, I haven't checked. I don't necessarily think that all the elderly are in favor of that one. But this is both a failure to value life and a failure to love your neighbor. Doing the wrong thing is never loving, even if the person himself may want it they think at the moment. In Romans chapter 1, verses 28 through 32, this comes right after this section about homosexuality. And he gives us a list of where Gentile society was. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Judges offers us a condemnation of the society in their day, and Paul comes forward a little more than 1,000 years later to do the same. With moral failures so deep, should it really surprise us that Israel soon would clamor to be even more like the pagan nations around them? Because that's what they would do. It should surprise no one then that people in our own country, including those sitting on the Supreme Court, often point with approval to the various nations that are happily meandering along, celebrating their ungodliness. And says, that's what we need to be more like. Don't think that's not done without purpose. My friends, if we were slouching towards Gomorrah 20 years ago, I think it's safe to say that by now, America as a whole has set up shop in Sodom. But if you find it easy to see all these problems, I suggest we need to consider one more thing. All of this occurred within and among God's people, Israel. And within God's people today, the church, we have all of these problems to some degree, at least in the early stages. It's therefore essential that we address these things immediately and take a spiritual stand, not just a political one. Political stands aren't that hard. You'll find plenty of people that agree the spiritual stand, that's a lot tougher. We must not only preach accountability, we must practice accountability. We must not only talk about people respecting God's institution of marriage, we must refuse to accept the compromises and excuses that so many Christians now give in order to be more like the world. We must not only pay lip service, diligence, and work in the kingdom, we must make it our clear purpose and priority. We must not only quote, love thy neighbor, but also live it, beginning but not ending right here. We must not only object to lawlessness, but promote the existence of absolute standards. We must not only decry the normalization of sexual perversion, we must promote sexual purity. We must not only condemn the culture of death that's so calloused our society, we must show in everything that we do that we value life. Now, if this lesson has seemed like a political rant to you, I am sorry, it is not. If anything, it is a spiritual rant. Because the problems in our society are not political. They're spiritual. And until we address them as such, we're going to be doomed as a society. Because we're going to have all those signs that took Israel down and down and down. And it took a monarchy to solve it, temporarily. But more than that, until we address all of these as God's people, we're going to lose all credibility. Not only as a spiritual voice in society, but we lose credibility in heaven too. If we're not willing to put God's message and God's standards and God's way of living, of what He upholds, out on display for others, what is there for anyone to think we are associated with the God of heaven? This is why we exist. We have a role and a responsibility as God's people, not just to be saved, but to act like the saved. Not just to thank God for all He has done for us and love Him, but to do His will as people who love Him. Oh, it'd be nice if some things would change in society. But also remember this: Rome was worse. We're getting there. But Rome, when Christianity began on Pentecost, was already worse than where we are right now. And the church flourished. Why? Because people knew they were lost and they wanted to be saved. They knew they did not have anything in life, and yet they were offered hope. And that's what we need to do too. Remember, society can be an ugly place, but the church should be a beautiful place. Because it is, as one of our writers has said, it's just the vestibule of heaven. This is a place we come so we can enter into something even greater. You may not have seen all these problems going on. You may not have realized how related they all are. But I hope you'll think about it because of what happened in the book of Judges. That's God's word giving us a warning. That's really the entire purpose overall of the book of Judges. Not just to give us a bridge in history, it's to show us what happens when society neglects God. But let's realize one thing, and then we'll close. You cannot wave a magic wand and make society stop neglecting God. You cannot do something and convince everyone to change and be dedicated to doing what's right. You're not expected to. But you are expected to make sure you aren't neglecting God, that you aren't letting your standards drop, that you're living for Him. That you can do. If we're all doing it, the church will be doing it. If the church is doing it, we will be a light to a world that needs us. But if we're not, all those 7 things that destroy society, it'll destroy the church faster. My friends, if you've never obeyed the gospel to become His by being immersed in water for the remission of your sins, we plead with you to do so. But my friends, most of who I see here are Christians. Do we want the church to be what God wanted it to be, or we want it to just drift along with wherever the world is, because that's an ugly place? We can't be a light if we put out the light. We cannot in any way help people if we throw the salt away ourselves. We have to shine. We have to be the society that would be right and good, that people would love to be part of when it doesn't exist anywhere else. I don't know that we're always doing that great a job at it. We can do better. And that's what we need to do. If you have any need at all, won't you please come while we stand and sing?